Welcome to the Texas Signal. We're joined today by Chris Bell. Thank you, Chris, for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Chris is one former congressman. He is one of several candidates running for the U.S. Senate seat in Texas against John Cornyn. There's a number of Democrats who'll have to fight with first before the general election. I guess, Chris, first, why are you jumping in this thing? Why have you already jumped in this thing?
Well, there are a couple of motivating factors, one of the biggest being Donald Trump. And I've been pretty horrified, like a lot of other people, ever since 2016 when he got elected. I never thought that we would have a president like this, or a president who would conduct himself in this manner. And one thing that has been greatly upsetting is to see that we have a United States Senator in John Cornyn who has basically become a water boy for Donald Trump.
I like that. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad.
We've used it before, giving you credit.
Well, I have, and I think that is what he has become. And by doing so, he's really not representing Texas values. When he won't speak out and join with his Republican colleagues in condemning the Mexican tariffs, for instance, that would be terrible policy for the state of Texas. When you look at what's going on in the border with the detention centers, and he speaks out against the businesses who said they would no longer join with those who were in the detention center business. He criticized them instead of actually speaking out against the detention center. So it's one thing after another. And I think that in order to be effective, then you need experience. And I have congressional experience. I'm the only Democrat in the race who has congressional experience and has run a statewide campaign. And so I think I'm in a very good position to not only win, but also to lead once I get there.
You made it official when you filed your FEC paperwork when?
Right before the 4th of July.
Okay. Any idea how much money you raised so far?
Not really. I mean, that was one of the reasons for formalizing everything with the FEC so that we could go after that with a vengeance. Right. Because, the toughest money is going to be in the primary. There's no doubt about it. I think whoever the nominee is going to be very well funded, just like Beto O'Rourke was well funded. But there are really 4 competitive candidates in the Democratic primary. I think that's good. I think it signifies growth. And I think they're going to be different stages. I think you're going to have to get somewhere between 100 and 500,000 in the early stages, and then, probably 1 million to 2 million when it plays out. Primaries, obviously, maybe more. Primaries, obviously, less expensive than a general election, and there are ways to keep costs down, but still going to be important.
So your healthcare plan in particular stands out from most of the other Democrats who have at least announced so far in the race. Talk a little bit about how, many of them do not support Medicare for all.
Right, and they made it very clear. They all say they want to treat healthcare as a right. They want to improve access to healthcare, but then they won't sign on with Medicare for all. I hoped we wouldn't have to go there. But we gave the insurance companies a chance to play fair. And instead, what many people have seen is basically the equivalent of catastrophic care policies. When you're paying somewhere around $1,000 a month and you have a $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 deductible, and that's really no policy at all. What that is a catastrophic care policy. And if you have something horrible happen to you, then you can say, oh, I have this insurance policy. But for the most part, you're just paying out of pocket. And I think until we have either Medicare for all, at least access to Medicare for all, where the private insurance companies, at the very least, are going to have to compete against Medicare, you're never really going to have a fair system. And I really do believe that healthcare is a right, and I want to see it treated that way.
So do you want to scrap the ACA?
Well, if we have to, we can either, if there are ways to improve upon it, we can. And I think all of these things have to be negotiated. But really, I think you have to start from a very strong position like Medicare for all if you're going to come up with a plan that's actually going to work for the American people and the people here in Texas.
So one of my big things, I think you may know this, we've known each other before I started the company, but um, a message of Democrats is different than policy positions. And so having a succinct, memorable, emotional, singular message, I think is very important in campaigns. And so my question to you is, what, separate your policy positions aside for a minute, what is your, if you haven't developed it yet, fine, but what is your message that you're running on that you want folks to,
Well,
to know?
that Texas can lead again, and we are so perfectly positioned in this state to be an example for the rest of the country. Let's take climate change. We have more renewable resources, energy, than probably any place in the world. And so, if we want to remain the energy capital going forward, uh, we need to be leading in that regard. On guns, obviously, we have a lot of gun owners here in the state of Texas. I don't want to take their guns away unless they're assault weapons. People don't need to own weapons of war. And so, what I really want to see is Texas be the leader that it should be, because a lot of people have said recently that as goes Texas, so goes the rest of the country. Well, that's kind of frightening given the path that we've been on, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Who, you mentioned a minute ago the four major candidates on the Democratic side running for the U.S. Senate. There's I guess six or seven total. Of those four, who's your biggest competitor? Do you see it being geography? Since Edwards in Houston, do you see Royce West since he's up there in Dallas? MJ, I mean, where?
It's really hard to say, and I think we'll campaign everywhere. As I tell folks, I think, a very wide lane available to me, and a lot of voters who will be receptive to our message. I think they'll be receptive to the whole idea of someone who actually has experience going back to the United States Congress to serve in the Senate. I think that's going to be worrisome to some that folks lack that experience, and so. I think there's a good variety and a good mix, but until there's some polling and some data to go on, I think it's really hard to say how it's all going to stack up.
As you said, also too, you're the only candidate in the race who's run a statewide campaign, uh, and that was for governor. What did you learn from that?
That this is an incredible state and extraordinarily diverse, and that's just not talk. It really is true, and it's fascinating as you travel around to see how different uh, certain areas of the state are from others. And I also learned that kind of the things that you have to take very seriously, and some of the things that you probably get a little too exercised about that you don't have to get exercised about in a campaign, and that it's a long haul. It is a long slog in a statewide campaign in Texas, and you have to treat it that way. It's not a sprint. You're not going to come out of the gate and win the race. You really just need to have a plan to take it from here to the finish line. And I think it's also very important. I think another big lesson, another big takeaway from that campaign is that in the general election, it's very important to be able to introduce yourself and to the voting public. I and that really has to happen in the summer before the general election. You don't let your opponent define you. And so that was one of my big disappointments. I didn't have the money to go on television in the summer before the general election. And so we were in sort of this sprint at the very end. And really, the clock ran out on us.
What year was that?
It was 2006. And so, that's a very valid point, Kevin, and that obviously I'm going to have to reintroduce myself to the people of Texas, and not all of those voters are around anymore. But what I do find to be comforting is that those who do recall the race, most recall it very favorably. Because we came closer than anyone since Richards in winning. It was a single digit margin between Rick Perry and me. And truthfully, if the Democrats hadn't taken our eye off the ball and had not supported Carol Strayhorn, who was running as an independent, then we probably would have been able to win it.
In terms of immigration, do you agree with? I mean, look, I think that Democrats are all over the place. I think on this issue, from the presidential level on down. But I mean, where are you generally on immigration? But also, I'm curious if you agree with Julian Castro's position of decriminalizing people coming across the border.
And I don't have a problem with it, and I think it's a good proposal, and it would demonstrate some compassion. These people are not criminals; they're coming here for, in large part. I'm sure there are going to be some bad apples in the bunch, just like there are, regardless of what you're talking about. But most of the people are trying to escape some really horrible conditions. And I think one of the most interesting things that was said to me years ago regarding people coming here from Mexico was from a gentleman who resides on the border. And he was saying that as long as people are living on mudslide hills and cardboard boxes in Mexico, they are going to find a way to get into the United States where they can perhaps face some great opportunities. And so that's the reality. And the other reality is that we're not going to be able to deport millions of people. That's not the least bit realistic. And so with any true immigration plan, you have to have a pathway to citizenship. I don't have a problem with increasing security. If we want to increase the number of border guards, if we want to do a better job with technology, like with drones, to send messages back to the guards so that we can cover a wider swath of the border, that's all well and good. But with any of that also has to come a pathway to citizenship. And the other thing that often gets overlooked, Kevin, is the fact that our economy, to a large extent, has become, especially here in Texas, has become somewhat dependent on the immigrant community.
You bet, especially in this state. So, have you been having fun? What's your mood on the trail?
Well, I have. I mean, anytime you have to get on the phone and ask people for money, it's not a day at the beach, yeah, but it's a kind of the necessary evil of campaigning. But yeah, I have had fun. I've loved being back in the arena. I'm really excited about the race. I think it's an incredible opportunity. I didn't know if I was going to live long enough to see the pendulum actually swing, and I was so excited by what we saw in 18. I think Donald Trump continues to be a huge motivating force, both in Texas and across the United States, and I think he's going to allow us to close the gap in 2020. And so I'm glad to be back in the mix.
It's good to be living in a swing state. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
You bet.